Hey everybody out there, this is Tony Mandeal at Anatomy FX, and we're here shooting the second part of the mummy sculpture that I posted on the Ko-Fi page. Now, if you guys saw on either my Facebook or my Instagram, there's a link to go to my Ko-Fi where you can subscribe for as low as $3 and watch a 6.5-minute video of me doing this sculpture. It's a time-lapse video. It's a 6-hour sculpture and it was cut down to 6.5 minutes in time-lapse. So here we are with the second stage. What we want to do now is we want to take this sculpture and make a stone mold of it that is going to be suitable for casting a latex mask out of. So we're going to be making our mold out of a gypsum product called Ultracal 30. And it's a little bit of a harder stone. It's a stone that I used for about 20 years when I made all my prosthetic appliances. A lot of mask makers are going to prefer to use something called white hydrocal because it's more porous and it's easier to get a good latex thickness when you're pouring a latex mask. I personally don't like it because I feel like it's a little too soft and brittle. So when I do my latex masks, I still stick with Ultracal because it's a little firmer, it's not as easy to scratch or chip off anything. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through the steps of making a Ultracal mold of this sculpture. Now, because this is a water-based clay, you want to make sure that it's sealed really, really well. So I, force dried the surface of this with a hair dryer to get it to kind of a leathery surface. It's wed clay or a Laguna clay EM217, traditionally called wed clay. And it doesn't dry and crack like your standard pottery clays do. It gets a little bit of a leathery surface. So I dried it with a hair dryer to get it to a little bit of a firm surface. And then I sealed it with about 3 coats of Rust-Oleum clear. Just happens to be what my local Home Depot had to really seal in that entire sculpture. And then I gave it a few coats of Man Ease Release, mold release, and that's going to make the clay a little bit easier to clean out of the Ultracal. So we're going to go ahead and start with a bucket and some water, and I know my head's getting cut off, but I'm shooting this with the phone rather than the standard video camera because I wanted you guys to really see the sculpture. So I'm going to pour a little bit of water in this bucket, and unfortunately there's no formula. It's a lot of eyeballing it. Sometimes you mix too little, sometimes you mix too much. But we're going to do 3 steps. We're going to do what's called a splash coat, and we're just going to mix up some stone and we're going to brush it in all the little details. And then we're going to do a reinforcement coat, and we're going to take these hemp fibers and soak it in the stone, and we're gonna lay it all down to give it some reinforcement, and then we're gonna do a top coat that'll make it all smooth and pretty. So I poured a little bit of water in this bucket, and I have my Ultracal 30 down here, which is a plaster, a gypsum stone actually. But you wanna sift the Ultracal into the water slowly. You don't wanna just dump it in, and you always wanna add your Ultracal to the water and not vice versa. And the reason for both of those is you want to make sure that the plaster is really absorbing all of the water. Normally I would wear a dust mask for this, but it's hard to talk and explain things to you through a dust mask. So just make sure you're working in a well-ventilated area. Preferably outdoors, not in a tight room. Don't do this in your bedroom. This is a large studio space with high ceilings. So I'm continuing to add the Ultracal, and we're going to keep sifting it in there until we get like little islands right on the surface of the water. And I'll try and show you what that looks like. So I'm probably not going to be able to see in there, but yeah, you're not going to be able to see it. But I keep sifting it in until I start seeing dry Ultracal up on the surface of the water, and then I'm going to let that water completely soak into those little dry pockets of Ultracal sitting on the surface until it's completely saturated, and then I'm going to go ahead and mix it. That way I know all of my stone is completely saturated with water. And again, bear with the framing of this video. Like I said, I'm just shooting this really quickly with my phone rather than with the video camera that I normally shoot all my other tutorials. So we're pretty well saturated. So I'm going to go ahead and start mixing it up. Make sure that there's no chunks. You really want to break it up, really want to get it completely mixed. You can use a drill and a squirrel mixer to do this too, especially if you're working with larger batches. And I've got a 2-inch chip brush, and I'm going to start really sort of aggressively brushing it into all those details. You want to make sure you're not trapping any air anywhere. And if your clay is dry enough, you're not going to actually disturb the surface of the sculpture. And I know a couple of mold makers who will have an air hose with a low pressure setting, and as they're brushing that first coat in, they'll sort of chase it around with the air hose and make sure they're working it into every nook and cranny. There's no right or wrong way to do a lot of these things. It's whatever works best for you. People tend to fall into the habit of the way they were taught, and then it's hard for them to get out of that habit and see another way of doing things. I'm being real sloppy around the table, which you can't see, but that's all right because I've got it sitting on a piece of a waxed paper called polycoat, so when our mold is done, it's just going to pop right off of there. And I really want to be kind of aggressive and make sure that I'm not trapping any air pockets anywhere. Really work it into every little wrinkle and fold, make sure it's up in those ears. And the Ultracal is going to thicken slowly, so as you brush it, it'll start getting thicker and thicker. It's not just going to like turn hard right away. So that helps you make sure that you're building up a decent coat. You don't have any exposed clay anywhere. Coverage everywhere. So I'm going to let that be, and I'm going to go ahead and start mixing up the next batch, and that's going to be our reinforcement layer for our hem. Now it is important to note that with these gypsum products, the hotter the water, the faster your plaster is going to set. So that's something to keep in mind and experiment with and see what temperature works best for you. Here at Anatomy FX, we don't actually have a hot water heater, so the temperature of the water is whatever it happens to be when it comes out of the pipes. This being Florida in July, it's still pretty warm. So I'm going to pour a little bit more water this time because I want to make sure that I have enough material to saturate my hem. And I'm going to go ahead and start adding my Ultracal to this. And I'm going to keep sifting it. I don't want to rush and start dumping it in there because I want to make sure that the water is fully absorbing into all of that plaster. But it is important to be mindful of your time. You want to start adding your next layer before the first layer has fully dried. If this layer fully dries and starts to harden before I start adding that next layer, you run the risk of what's called delamination, which means the layers aren't going to bond to each other and they're going to want to separate and break. So I want to make sure that I start getting my hemp added when this is sort of firm to the touch but not fully hardened. That way they have more tendency to bond to one another. And again, I'm not wearing a dust mask because I'm talking to you and it's a bit of a hindrance, but this is a large studio space with high ceilings. But when you're working with this material, you want to make sure to avoid breathing any of that dust. It does have crystalline silica in it, which is not something that you want to be breathing a lot of. It can cause some serious lung damage over the years. I definitely mixed up too much, but I think it's better to have too much than too little in this case. So I've got my little plaster islands on the surface. I'm going to let those fully absorb that water, and then I'm going to go ahead and start mixing. So the Ultracal has fully absorbed all of the water in this bucket, so I'm mixing it now. I've got some gloves on at this point because I don't like getting my hands too dirty if I can avoid it. Now the material that we're going to be using is hemp fibers, and you can buy this stuff in the bale, and it's fairly inexpensive, and you pull off little sections of it and kind of fluff it into these little bird's nests. And we're going to saturate this with the Ultracal, and then we're going to put it on, and that's going to create our extra reinforcement. So as we're handling the mold and it's getting moved around, it's less likely to break or crack, and if it does crack, the fibers are going to hold it together. You can also use burlap if you can't find hemp. You can go to your local Home Depot in the garden section and buy rolls of burlap, and it's very cheap. And it's the same principle. You saturate the burlap with the Ultracal and you lay it on. So I'm going to take my hemp fiber, my little bird's nest of hemp, and I'm going to soak it in Ultracal. I want to make sure that all of those little fibers are saturated. And then I'm going to lay it on. And I'm just going to do one overlapping layer over the whole sculpture. You want to really work it in and make sure you're not trapping any air pockets anywhere. I've prepared 7 of these little bird's nests. I hope that's enough. I'm really pushing it in there because now our splash coat, our first layer is pretty firm to the touch but not fully dry, so I know I'm not going to damage the sculpture underneath. So I'm really pushing in that burlap and making sure I'm not trapping any air anywhere. You don't want any air pockets in your molds because then you got to go ahead and patch them from the inside later on, and that's a pain in the butt. I think it's safe to say I didn't prepare enough hemp, so I'm going to have to step away and prepare a little bit more to finish this off. Okay, so we have a decent reinforcement layer of hemp all over our entire sculpture, and it's really worked in there, and it doesn't feel like there's any air pockets, nothing trapped that I have to worry about. It all feels like it's pretty well saturated and down on top of the sculpture. So I'm gonna strip off my gloves and I'm gonna go ahead and start prepping the last layer, and we're gonna mix up a really thick batch of Ultracal that we're gonna sort of sculpt over this entire surface for that final beauty coat, make it nice and smooth, and we're gonna give it a flat plane on top. That way when we flip our mold over and set it on the table, it's not gonna wobble while we're filling it with latex. All right, so we've got our last batch of Ultracal here, and we got a larger container, and we added more of the powder, more of the actual plaster to the water than we have to this point, because we want this material to be thicker. We want it to be sort of trowelable and hold a vertical surface, so you can see that it's not liquidy. That first coat that we did, that brush up coat, when I'm telling people how to mix it, I often refer to it as ice cream soup. But this is more of like an oatmeal consistency, and we get it to this by just adding more powder to the water than we have previous. So it's pretty thoroughly mixed, and I could probably add even more to it at this point, but I think we'll just go ahead. We're gonna start doing a final layer on top of our hem, and this final coat is just gonna smooth everything over and give it a little more bulk and make it much prettier on the outside, rather than having all those hemp textures on the outside of the mold. This used to be how I made all of my molds for 20 some odd years. All of my prosthetic molds, all of my mask molds, everything was made with this material because it was cheap. It was relatively easily obtainable. Growing up on the New Jersey shore, I had to take trips into New York City to get this stuff at a store called The Complete Sculptor, which is still there today. But nowadays, when we do our prosthetic makeups and our mask molds, more often than not, they're lightweight fiberglass molds or epoxy resin molds, which are more durable, they're lighter, but they're definitely more costly. So I haven't messed with this material too much, this material, in 5 years, until the COVID lockdown, and everybody was sort of at home and not working and kind of doing their own things to stay sane. So I started sort of re-exploring my roots and doing some old-fashioned latex masks, and I realized how much I missed it, doing the sculptures in the wet clay and then doing these inexpensive stone molds for just casting latex masks. And it definitely takes me back to my childhood, and I really missed doing it. So I think I'm going to make it a point to do more of these molds, because there's not a lot of investment financially, and they're just fun. It's just sort of like old-fashioned way of doing things, old-fashioned mold making, and there's a certain nostalgia to it for me. And I'm going to switch now to this little tool. This is called a rubber kidney tool, and this is the kind of thing that's pretty standard in pottery. And it's a rubber silicone tool. It's flat on one end and rounded on another, and we can use that to start sort of like as a spatula, like you're icing a cake. Start working that material up. It's getting a little bit thicker and a little bit more of a trowelable consistency, and these pottery tools really help in just getting everything smooth and pretty looking. All right, we're almost ready to walk away from this mold now. We've got it pretty smooth with our kidney tool, Right now the Ultracal is still in a little bit of a workable state. So what we want to do is just going to go ahead and buff it and make it smooth. And again, everybody does this a little bit differently. I'm going to start with a cut off piece of a Scotch-Brite dish sponge. And I'm just going to start working it around the whole thing and getting out any sort of like lumps or uneven sections, just sort of raking the material down with the sponge, with the rough part of the sponge. You can work this material and sort of polish it right up until it completely hardens on you. So I'm going to start tearing off sections of paper towel and folding it into small sections like this, and you can go ahead and start buffing the stone. And the more you move the paper towel around, the smoother you're going to make the stone. And then usually I'll get in at the very end and just buff it with my hands as well. Make a nice smooth mold. That's pretty good, and I'm just going to finish it off buffing it with my hands. And you can see it's pretty well hardened at this point. There's going to be a little more moisture. It's going to be a little more workable down at the bottom of the mold where everything drips than up at the top, so you can sort of take some of that moisture and work it back in. We're going to walk away from this now. This is going to go through a heating and cooling process. It's going to get so hot that you could actually see steam rising up off of it. And then when it's fully cooled down, we'll know we're ready to go ahead and demold it and dig all of that clay out of there. So thanks for watching. Again, this is Tony Mandiel at Anatomy FX in Orlando, Florida. It's July 25th and it's about 95 degrees in here. So through this entire process, we've gotten a little bit sweaty, but that's the special effects industry. It's not all glamour and glitz and, you know, face off. The people that do this kind of work behind the scenes and in the shops, it's gritty, grimy, dirty work, and you know, those are the real heroes, the ones that are there making in the shop, you know, doing all the sculpting and mold making and working with all the chemicals and the materials and bringing all this stuff to life. It's a dirty, hot, sweaty job, and I love it. And I, you know, have a lot of friends that have worked in this industry for as long as I have, and a lot of friends that are half my age who are just getting into the industry. And you know, it's in their blood. If you want to get dirty and you want to get grimy and you want to, you know, work around these materials, then you can create some really amazing things. So I hope you learned something, and I hope you come back to Ko-Fi and subscribe to more videos and donate and keep Anatomy FX alive through the entire COVID crisis until the theme parks come alive again. So thanks for watching.